The date is December 18th, 1994. I want to tell you about Lobdell's farm. Before World War II, some areas of Stratford were still unbuilt, and there were many little truck farms. Gradually, after the war, as housing was developed, these truck farms all disappeared. But one of the last of them, and very close to Paradise Green, was Lobdell's farm. William Irving Lobdell, Ike, he was known as, was born in about 1855 and died about 1954 at age 99. In 1906, he bought from one of the Curtises 15 acres of land on Huntington Road at where Torrey Hill itself is. The house number was number 317 Huntington Road, and it's still there. I want to describe the property, the operation of the farm, and the Lobdells themselves. When I knew Ike in the 1920s and 1930s, he was already pushing 80 or beyond that, and he was still a physically a very strong and healthy man. He, in appearance, he had a white mustache and white hair. He usually wore overalls. I remember him coming along in these old brown overalls whose buckle on the straps would be stamped either President Police or Oshkosh Bagosh. With that, high shoes, high-laced shoes for use in the fields, or oftentimes boots. The welly is not a new idea because his boots were very, very similar to the modern Wellington. I remember him sitting up on his back porch on an old park bench, taking off those shoes in order to enter the house. Each noon, Letty would call him back in for lunch, and sometimes he would be up the top of the hill near our house on what is now Shepherd Street, a good well over 1,000 feet away from the barn, and you could hear Letty shouting for him. He would go down, go in, have his lunch, rest a bit after lunch, and then go back into the fields. But always he took off his shoes or his boots before entering the house. That was a command. Letty herself was a wonderful person when you got to know her, but she was very strict and stern, and she was usually bawling somebody out, justifiably so. She often would rant at him, and he would just sit there and chuckle, never really answered her, but seemed to enjoy having her cackle at him. It was the second marriage for both of them. His first wife had died many, many years ago, and Letty was a widow who lived across the street on Huntington Road. Bennett was her name, until they were married. Letty stands for Celeste. In about 1947, they sold the farm to Chief Nichols, who in turn sold it to McNeil and Blamey, and it's the first place that McNeil and Blamey put up large quantities of their standard house. He went to stay at Sunnyside, which was the old Brewster house and is now Adzima's funeral home, until he died. Later, she went to live in an apartment at Stanley Johnson's place on Main Street, and the Johnsons were absolutely wonderful to her. She too ended up passing away in the Sunnyside rest home. The farm on Huntington Road stretched from The bottom of the hill, where it had been contiguous to Strasburger's property, up to Mount Pleasant, which at that time was known as the Lane or Lobdell's Lane. And it really was a lane. It was unpaved, and the trees met overhead so that it was quite shady. Very little sunlight penetrated this lane. The lower part, up past the log cabin, was adjacent to and just formed the north edge of Lobdell's property. Just to the south of the lane, there would be a stone wall, and the apple orchard and pasture were located. The lane did a turn beyond the log cabin, where it crossed the brook and continued due west to where it met what is presently Freeman Avenue. So all of the present Mount Pleasant Avenue was there as lane. It was quite impassable up beyond Denton's house, where Mr. Denton and his housekeeper lived. Letty always referred to Mr. Denton's woman as his housekeeper, not as his girlfriend or anything of that sort. And I still remember Denton and his housekeeper walking up the road where they had, after they'd been down to one of the local taverns, and staggering a little bit as they went back to Denton's house. Between Denton's and the little bungalow that was Dolly Martin's house, it was totally impassable in the 1930s because nobody used it. But then west of that again, to get to the Martin house, you could drive a vehicle in from Nichols Avenue. The front of Lobdell's property on Huntington Road also had a stone wall that led down to the south end of it. And then along the south side, a barbed wire fence took you practically all the way to the brook. It went from east on Huntington Road to its west end, which was very close to the brook, and divided Lobdell's property from the Strasburger property that was later divided up, and on which homes were built by Ulrich Drittenbass, and the road, of course, was named Ulrich Road. Where that fence ended, there was a little jog in the pasture, and then a stone wall proceeded north and started up the hill. Within a few feet, that stone wall met another one that extended further south and enclosed the southwestern lot on the Lobdell property. As I said, it was 15 acres all in all, and within that 15 acres were 5 planting fields and the pasture with an orchard and a brook and an upper meadow. The stone wall that I mentioned, running north-south at the east end of the southwest lot, ran down to Tom Dew's property, and then another stone wall took off toward what is now Shepherd Street, to the rear of the properties on Shepherd Street. Barbed wire fence took over behind number 34, number 54, and number 74 Shepherd Street. By the way, that was called North Park Street until about 1932. As I say, a fence took over behind the properties of Waits and Mrs. Hawley and the Knapps. Beyond the Knapps' property, on the north edge of their property, a barbed wire fence ran the 114 feet to Shepherd Street Road itself, and then the fence ran north along Shepherd Street up to its junction with Monroe Street. Another barbed wire fence ran along Monroe Street to the Martin house that stood on Monroe Street. From the rear of that house, with one jog, a barbed wire fence led north, then west, then north again, to the point where it intersected the stone wall that was on the lane around Mount Pleasant Avenue. Thus the whole thing was enclosed. Of the fields, the one closest to the house, stretching from Huntington Road to the brook, or almost to the brook, was called the Flats, and it was rather it was stoneless, and it was rather similar to the flats that the Ryans and Callahans had down in Lordship. Awfully good for planting and for plowing, because there were no stones in it to speak of, and it was in fact flat and rather moist in the summertime. Beyond the pasture and the brook, off to the west of that, and stretching up to Shepherd Street, was a hillside field. That field was smaller than the flats, but was quite useful for things that could use a little drier soil. Potatoes, for example, were growable there, and in that lot, Mr. Lobdell would grow corn in the upper part of it usually, and he would sometimes put his tomatoes in there and other vegetables of that sort. Beans often went in that lot. It was probably the lot he used more than anything else other than the flats, because it was second closest to the house. Across the middle of that lot was his asparagus patch. The southwest lot that I mentioned to the south of that was divided from the one I've just described by another stone wall, and in that southwest lot also potatoes, corn, vegetables in general were grown. The fence, the stone wall itself that divided those two lots on its south side, of course, was rather warm and sunny, and that is where in one spot the rhubarb was planted, and in another location the raspberry patch existed. About halfway up the lane from the barn to the western edge of the property was what I always called the round field. Its only access was from a break in the stone wall of the lane, or Mount Pleasant Avenue. It was surrounded on the east, south, and west sides by a fence, and on all three of these sides the pasture was on the other side of the fence, so the purpose of the barbed wire fence was to keep the cows out. The round field was used for corn and things like that. Further west along Monroe Street was what I might call the Monroe Street field. It was at the top of the hill, and its one side was on Monroe Street. The other side was fairly close to a brook, the other side of which was the meadow. The lot, the Monroe Street lot, was, because it was top of the hill and it was dry and pebbly, was the kind of place where Mr. Lobdell planted his cabbages and his turnips and vegetables like that could take a little bit of stoniness and didn't require an overly great amount of moisture. So we've described the 5 planting fields, an expanse of land that connected all of these fields, running from the barn down on the corner of Huntington Road and Mount Pleasant, all the way to the western edge of the property, which was halfway up Monroe Street, and touching each and every one of the fields that we talked about was the pasture. Usually a pasture would be located where you couldn't do much else with the field, and the pasture ran First of all, through the apple orchard behind the barn. There was an ancient apple orchard uh, running along Mount Pleasant, fairly far west from the barn, not quite to the brook. The apple trees were bound, or their trunks were bound in chicken wire so that the cows wouldn't shoo away on the trunk. And the best apples, of course, were always the ones that had landed in what the cows had done. The extension beyond there, it was just beyond this point that the brook ran through the property. And it came from a maple swamp to the north, and ran down amongst huge rocks, 10 or 12-foot rocks, and down waterfalls in the foresty, tree-laden area here, to a bridge or culvert that the lane ran over. South of that, it came through this sunny and sparkling pasture. The brook then left the property at along its south edge, passed under like a 30-foot wooden bridge, which was built in expectations that the road that ultimately became Ulrich Road would be created there. Actually, when Ulrich Road was created, the whole brook was culverted by that time. But it ended up leaving the property fairly close to where that bridge that crossed Ulrich Road was. Along the brook, in the northern part of it, was a bit of marsh and another well. This well was set up so that in the midsummer, when things had pretty much dried up, there would still be places that you could get water for the fields if you're doing any planting in the midsummer, or water for the cows. There was a tub next to it, and we would have to go down there occasionally and bucket out the water and put it in the tub for the cows in the middle of the summer. My brother Ray had the task of cleaning up that well one time, and it was done by putting a ladder down it and going down and filling buckets with mud, and then having Mr. Lobdell, who was up at the top, hoist them all out. Ray said it wasn't the best job that he was ever given to do there. Not very far beyond where that well was, not very far south of it, was a little bridge crossing the middle of the pasture and leading to the far fields. That is a lane or roadway leading to the far fields from that bridge. South of that, and to the south border of the property, it was a little more marshy, and in the early summer, the blue flag and the cowslips were absolutely fabulous. A little pool that had been created right at that bridge was also useful for bucketing water up into barrels and then taking it up to the fields. And that's where Jimmy the bullfrog lived. Jimmy was just about the biggest green frog I've ever seen, and he was there year after year after year after year. From the brook, the pasture extended west between the hillside field that I had mentioned and the round field. It ran up along a smaller brook where the rocks had never been cleared out and the area was too moist to use for anything other than pasture, but it made great pasture. The pasture then narrowed down and turned north and entered the southeast corner of the meadow that I was describing that stood up at that point. It was a very large meadow, and that's where our haying was done when it was done on the property. The old man would often buy hay from someone else. That is, he'd buy haying rights from someone else. But on his own property, that field was the haying field for the property. Down at the house was the farmyard. There, aside from the house, he had the barn, a two-story barn with a hayloft above the main floor, and a cowshed behind it. Within the cowshed also were two stalls for the horses, so that as you left the main part of the barn and hopped down to the area where the two enclosed horse stalls were, you went through a corridor and then found yourself in the cowshed. There were 5 stalls there for cows. The second largest building was what he called the shop. It was really another smaller barn, 2 stories, although the outside stairs that led to the second story had long since deteriorated and were absolutely impossible to use. If you did want to go up into the upper part of the shop, up into the loft of the shop, what you did was go through a hole in the shop building itself. Half of the shop building had an open front, and that's where the truck and the wagon were kept. The other half was the shop itself, and the rear part of that was caged in for chickens. The loft in that was marvelous for a kid to explore because it had all sorts of things that had not been used for ages. There was, for example, an ancient sleigh up there that had probably not been in use for 20 or 30 years, even when I saw it in the early 1930s. South of the shop was a small mansard roof, or I should say monitor roof garage of the type that was built earliest for cars, and in that, in the early days, Mrs. Lobdell kept her, I think it was a 1923 Ford coupe. After she stopped driving, the concrete floor of the garage was a very useful place for drying out onions or drying out seeds. He kept seeds from his own vegetables. When he found himself with good vegetables, instead of buying from Sears Roebuck or from one of the local seed outfits, he would use his own seed, and often made out very well that way with vegetables that were better than those of other people. The barnyard also contained the chicken coop that ran well, I say chicken coop, the chicken run, because the chickens lived below the main floor of the big barn, and the chicken run ran between the barn and the shop, and then out toward the pasture and the flats. In the middle of that was the little outhouse, which I never used because it canted at about 20-degree angle, I would say, and looked to me as though it would collapse on you if you went into it. The chickens themselves were fed conventional chicken scratch, but they also had an opportunity to eat old vegetables. Things of that sort were tossed into the chicken yard for them. So they got a pretty varied diet. In front of the shop was a tub, and in the wintertime, when the celery was taken out of the trenches, it had been stored in trenches. The celery then, by the way, was all white bleached celery. The so-called Pascal green celery that didn't require bleaching didn't exist. I think the white celery had a wonderful, wonderful flavor, but it was a awful task in the late fall or winter time when you're out there in the dead cold and you're washing off this celery in the tub and then putting a red elastic band around it for appearance sake and trimming the roots off of it. It didn't take very long for your hands to get absolutely ice cold. Also in the barnyard, up just behind the fence for the house's backyard, was one of the most marvelous butternut trees I've ever seen. It was huge, and the butternuts, although just about impossible to crack, were the most tasty of nuts. Underneath the butternut tree, the grindstone stood. It was a foot treadle operated machine. Had once had 2 treadles, but one of the treadles had long since disappeared, and so that at this point the thing speeded up and slowed down as you pumped the remaining treadle. The result was the grindstone had turned quite elliptical and was just about totally out of round. To the south of the house and next to the barnyard was a spot where all the hotbeds were, and there were 4 or perhaps at one point as many as 6 of these hotbeds, each of them 30, 40, 50 feet long, and old glass frames were put over them. To create a hotbed, he would dig down about 1.5 feet and fill 6 to 10 inches of this with new horse manure that was still acting, that was still quite warm. He would cover this with about 6 inches of soil and plant the seeds in that. The result was that without any artificial heat, the plants grew up marvelously quickly, and they looked absolutely great too, of course, because they reached down to these marvelous nutrients. As the beds were first planted in February or March, they had to be covered every night, and sometimes during the daytime, with a bunch of burlap blankets that he had there. Later in the season, it was proper to ventilate by pulling up a corner of each of these windows. Although they were made of glass, they were still flexible enough so that you could put a wedge under one corner and get a little bit of ventilation inside them. My first job on Lobdell's farm, believe it or not, was at age 5. Ray, who was 10 years older than I, had been working for Mr. Lobdell, and he took me down there one day. And Pa had died just a year ago, and I think the old man felt sorry for me. Anyhow, I was given the job of dropping lettuce. Now, in planting lettuce, you took it out of the hotbed, got a lot of mud on its roots, and the planters, went along on their knees, which were covered in burlap bags tied around the knees, and with a dibble in one hand, they would put the lettuce plants in 1 foot apart. The rows were 1 foot apart, plants were 1 foot apart. But to speed things up for them so that they didn't have to take the lettuce plants out of the box, a dropper was used, and the dropper was, as I say, when I was 5 years old, was me. And your task was to put a lettuce plant at each of the marked intersection points that had been done with something that looked like a huge rake before the process of planting started. I got a nickel an hour for that. My earliest memories of the animals on the farm, I remember Blackie, the horse. Blackie was a very large horse, but died when I was just a little kid, and the last horse that Mr. Lobdell had was Chubby. Chubby was all white and was, just as the name implied, not a large horse, but a pretty powerful animal. There were originally 5 cows, then that came down to 3, and then finally he got rid of the cows altogether. Mr. Wilcoxson would buy the milk from Lobdell, and of course Wilcoxon, this is Walter Wilcoxson, who lived down on the farms at the intersection of Wilcoxon Avenue and Main Street. And Wilcoxon had his own animals that he would pasture, sometimes on Paradise Green, sometimes up Huntington Road, sometimes in his own lots down to the east. Wilcoxon delivered milk in bottles to people all through Stratford. He had a horse and wagon to do this with, or a horse and carriage. I guess it was a wagon with a sunshade over the driver's seat. But part of his route was past Lobdell's barn, up the Lane or Mount Pleasant, and then down near the brook. He would open the gate, come into the pasture, cross the bridge that I talked about,
and then follow a lane that ran up on the north side of the hillside field and ended up at the intersection of Shepherd Street and Monroe Street, where Shepherd at that time ended there and Monroe went west. But on a sunny morning in June, we can still remember hearing Mr. Wilcoxon as he went up this lane, which was not steep, but it was a hill, singing hymns that you could hear all the way across the fields. When the horse would slow down or balk or stop on this hillside, he would curse out at the horse until the animal got going again, and then resume hymn singing. When Wilcoxon sold the route to Larry Spalmer, the hymns were replaced by a smell of a cigar wafting across the fields. Mr. Spalmer always had a cigar in his mouth. Not always lit, but he always had a cigar in his mouth. I was talking about the animals and got diverted a bit. I had mentioned the chickens and cows, and they also had, Mrs. Lobdell had something like 14 cats. With all that milk available, of course, it wasn't difficult to keep large quantities of cats. And with the grain that was around all over the place, it was necessary to keep down the rats and mice with something like that. The cows had to be milked every day. They were put out in the pasture in the summertime and in the fall, and fed corn stalks and things of that sort in the wintertime. But they themselves would come back to the barn, and I think they told time by the sun, because as the days shortened, they would arrive back at the barn earlier, and you would hear them lowing at 5 o'clock or so before the sun had gone on, because they knew that when they went back into the barn, they'd be fed something good and milked, and apparently they enjoyed that. I remember one time we had to take a cow up to be served. On a farm, being served had another meaning, and the nearest bull was about 1.5 miles up the street. The Mr. Lobdell and Steve Moyer would ride in the wagon. They tied the cow on behind the wagon, but I had to walk behind it with a switch to make sure that it followed up, and they got there in time. The people who had the bull, I don't remember what family it was now, but they were way up Huntington Road near Buck Swamp, and the procedure was to tie the cow with her head between the forked branches of an old apple tree out in the middle of their pasture, and then bring the bull out. The cow on the way back down was much more docile, and I got to ride in the wagon. I didn't have to force the cow to keep walking home. I remember one time when a cow calved out in the meadow. There were new calves every year, but I do remember that this meadow, which was in the farthest property from the barn, a cow dropped a calf out there one afternoon, and the old man had to go up there with a wheelbarrow, brought the calf back to the barn in a wheelbarrow with its mother following it and bellowing all the way. Chubby, of course, was a person unto himself. He was a good horse, a strong horse, but very, very fond of eating. And one of the ways in which I made money was to hold his head up when we were cultivating. If Mr. Lobdell were plowing or cultivating or something like that, he would have me lead the horse so that the horse couldn't turn around and nip the delicious young corn shocks on the way, because he'd be quite likely to do that kind of thing. There was a muzzle you could put over his mouth, and that was used sometimes too, that kept him from eating up the profits. I learned to harness the horse. The gear was pretty standard. You'd put the collar on first. You would then bring all the rest of the harness up over the horse and tighten the hames, buckle the hames over the collar. You had to buckle the belly buckle, and then you were ready to back the horse into the shafts and hook up the traces to the whiffle tree. The whiffle tree is the bar on the wagon rig or plow rig or the rig of any implement. The whiffle tree is the device that takes the load from the harness of the horse and draws along the implement. We had a great many horse-drawn implements, actually. There were the wagons. There were 2 wagons. There was a dump cart. The dump cart itself was used for bringing manure out to spread on the fields, and that was a tough job because it was just heavy work loading up the cart, and it was heavy work standing on top of the cart and slinging this stuff out, spreading it around the fields. The plow, of course, was one of the implements it used, and at this time, one of the last horse-drawn plows, it had 3 steel parts. The beam and the handle were both made of wood, but the steel parts were the mold board, the land side, and the point. The point itself was replaced fairly often. You sent to Sears Roebuck for these. The steel mold board had to be kept perfectly clean and was oiled at the end of each plowing to make sure that it didn't rust up. The land side, the other side, was the side that kept the furrow straight so that you can, or kept the furrow clean so that you could then dump the next furrow into it. You plowed in a clockwise direction, of course, because the mold board itself flipped the earth from the furrow off to the right. The next step after plowing was harrowing, and we had 2 kinds of horse-drawn harrows. One was the disc harrow, where these wheels rotated and chopped up the earth. You really needed the disc harrow in places like the flats, where the earth was moist and chunky. The other harrow had a series of tines and was used for breaking up drier earth. After harrowing, if you really wanted to flatten the surface before you did your planting, you brought in the stone boat. That was a device used in the wintertime, and it was simply a flat area or a flat board that you stood on top of and had the horse haul across the field in order to level things. In the wintertime and off-season, when you had time, if you're taking stones out of the field and putting them in the stone walls, why, they were put aboard the stone boat and brought to wherever they were going to be used. Once the crops were planted, that was only the beginning of it, because there was an awful lot of weeding and hoeing and harrowing and taking the suckers out of the corn plants, as well as squashing bean beetles in your hands and doing whatever was necessary to get rid of insects. Other varmints that you had to contend with were woodchucks, who were just as fond of corn stalks as Chubby was. I remember one time I was given the commission of catching woodchucks, and what you did was trap them, and you were paid 25 cents for each one, which Mr. Lobdell then skinned and fed to the cats. But the purpose in paying you the quarter was so that there would be fewer woodchucks to run rampant through the vegetables. I was not very good at this kind of thing. And I remember distinctly the time that in the trap, I had set the trap in the what I thought was a chuck hole, and turned out to be a skunk hole. Well, I didn't know what to do with the skunk, so I stood off about 10 feet and poked with a long stick to see if he was alive and active. He was. The squirt of the skunk has something like a 12-foot throw, I guess, and as I say, I was 10 feet away. And I'll tell you this, if he hits you in the eye, you will never smell it, because the sting is so abominably bad. It's butyl mercaptan, and it's an irritant as well as one of the most horrible smells in the world. I don't think the skunk likes the smell either. But if you're hit in the eye by it, you spend hours just washing it out before you can see again. It's a terrible experience, and that's what happened to me. So I got hold of Steve Moyer, who was a little bit older than I and had a hell of a lot more skills and common sense. Steve went up to the skunk trap holding a burlap bag in front of him, flipped the bag over the skunk, released the trap, and the skunk walked away. The summer harvest time was a time when probably the least unpleasant or most pleasant parts of farming occurred. Picking wasn't bad. Picking corn, Mr. Lobdell would pick the corn, and I would hold the bag. It was usually a burlap bag, and you put 100 in a bag. It was fairly heavy, I thought, but as an 80-year-old man, he would sling these bags over his shoulder and think nothing of it. If the corn ears were short, he wouldn't pick them. He'd leave them. Nubbins, he called them. And nubbins were fair game for us. It was the middle of the Depression. Pa had died. To help feed us, Mother did an awful lot of canning of whatever was available, and we had some of our own vegetables. But having Mr. Lobdell say, well, go pick all the nubbins, gave you, over a period of a couple of weeks, enough corn so that she could can all the corn we needed for the winter. This was also true of things like tomatoes. He had a tomato called Earliana that allowed him to get, I think it was $2.50 per half bushel at the beginning of the season, because he had tomatoes 2-3 weeks before anybody else. And the Earliana was a pretty good tomato. When the season went on and other people's tomatoes came in, the price of a basket of tomatoes came down to something like 25 cents. At that point, he just stopped picking and let them rot, and he'd tell us that we could have the tomatoes. So Ma would can 100 to 200 quarts of tomatoes every summer, using what Mr. Lobdell had given us. Other summer vegetables were beans and cabbage, and cauliflower was a later summer vegetable. You tied up the cauliflower leaves around the blossom itself so as to bleach it. Some vegetables that we have today weren't available then. Broccoli was unheard of. It really hadn't permeated the United States. And zucchini, which he called Italian squash, had just come in, and he did plant a little of that because Vic Musanti liked to sell that down in his market, his vegetable market. Among the varmints in the area were also rabbits. Rabbits, however, didn't eat much, and you'd see them hopping along the through the fields, and in midsummer there'd be a mother skunk with a couple little skunks. There was one in particular who used to follow Mr. Lobdell when he was harvesting corn, and she'd have 2 or 3 babies crawling all over her back and each other as she followed him. He would drop a wormy ear of corn, and the skunk and her children would eat that and would catch up to 10 minutes later to get another one. There were very few deer at this time. The deer population in the Stratford part of the state was very low. Once in a very great while we would see a deer off in the fields, but not very often at all. As to the rabbits, our little beagles would go out hunting by themselves, and you could hear them baying and chasing the rabbits all over the fields. I don't think they ever caught one, but Jackie and Boomer and Pete, the beagles that we had, were quite active in teaching themselves how to hunt rabbits during the summer. A little later in the season, the harvesting became a bit more work. Digging potatoes was not an easy job. What you did was to run the plow down the row of potatoes, and you ended up with all these potatoes hidden in this fresh dirt alongside of the furrow that you had dug. Then you had to find them and dig them out with a potato fork. So it meant leaning over and going the whole length of the fields to find the potatoes. I wasn't very good at it, and I got bawled out a couple times for sticking the potatoes with the potato fork. They weren't very saleable when you did much of that. It took me a while to learn. With potatoes also, in those days, the small potatoes weren't used for anything. They're a delicacy now. But the small potatoes were culls, and those were things that we could use ourselves. As the season went on, we found ourselves taking in the root vegetables. Turnips were among the last, and they were usually taken up after there had been a frost. A frost takes a bit of the bitterness out of a turnip, and he would wait until there had been a frost before he did that. They were then stored in trenches too. Cabbages were cut all season, but at the end of the season, the cabbages were pulled out by the roots and turned upside down. They too went into trenches and were available for half the winter to be taken and sold to the stores. Haying was another event that took place starting in the late summer and going through all of early autumn. Haying was fun because of the smell of the hay, but it was also a lot of work, and it did build muscles. The first task in haying was the mowing. We had a horse-drawn mowing machine, and once again I was taught how to use that, but wasn't afraid of it, and I was absolutely terrified of it. It had a cast iron formed saddle that you sat in, and then your hands held the reins, which also went around you so that you wouldn't lose them. Your major task in haying was steering to make sure that Chubby went down the right path adjacent to the path that you had just mowed, and making sure that you didn't hit any rocks. In the meadow, there were still many rocks that hadn't been taken out, and it was hell to run the sickle bar into a rock. If you did that, it kind of threw your seat up and over, and threw you forward either into the horse or into the bar itself. I never had the experience of hurting myself on it, but I was always terrified that I would. The task after cutting the hay was to rake it up, and we had a horse-drawn hay rake. This was somewhat more fun than the mowing machine itself. Took less skill anyhow than the mowing machine. It too was set up so that your feet worked pedals that drew the tines of the hay rake up off the ground, which was a little bit easier than having to flip the sickle bar up with your feet. After raking the hay up, you tedded it out there for several days. Uh, After about 2 days, you turned it over to make sure that it dried properly, and you might have to turn it over a second time. And then a couple days later, you would come up with a rig on the wagon that converted it really into a hay wagon, and loaded that up and took it down to the barn. It was awfully hot working up inside the loft. Mr. Lobdell would stand on the wagon and toss the hay up through an opening in the hay loft, and you would have to pick up the hay that was in that opening and flip it up to the top of the pile that you were making in the loft. It was totally dark in there, and the temperature was about 110 degrees, maybe more. And of course, the air was full of dust. So that was a part of the job that you were thankful for when the whole thing was done. Sometime before the last frost, the tomatoes were picked en masse. All the green tomatoes were put in the hotbeds on top of the burlap blankets that I mentioned. And as the weeks went on and they turned red, they were taken to the stores and vended out. Winter was catch-up time. It was when you repaired equipment that needed repairing and got ready for the spring. Lobdell, together with some of the other farmers, the Callahans and the Ryans, in the late 20s and early 30s, would buy fertilizer by the freight car load, and then the farmers would split up the cost of this. You kind of mixed your own. Later on, he would buy these 100-pound bags of 5-10-5. 5-10-5 means 5% nitrates, 10% phosphates, and 5% potassium. And this is essentially the mixture that they always used. But in the earlier days, they would buy those elements separately and mix things in themselves, mix bone ash in, whatever they needed for a particular crop, so that they could get a little closer to exactly what they needed for a particular crop than by buying the standard 5-10-5. The winter task that I used to find interesting was repairing old equipment. He very seldom bought handles for equipment whose handle had broken. Instead of that, he'd whittle or make his own handles. I know our corn cutters all had handles that were self-made, and many of the other pieces of equipment did the same thing. What you would do is go out to one of the nut trees, find a good piece of wood, cut it off the nut tree, bring it down. Sometimes he would do this ahead of time and then have it drying in the barn. But in the barn, together with a spoke shave and or other equipments of that sort, you would form your own handles for most of the equipment that he had. You seldom made it. You seldom bought that kind of thing. What he did buy was usually by a mail order from Sears Roebuck. Sears in those days had just about as complete a catalog of farm equipment and farm products that anybody in the world had, and you didn't need to go anywhere other than Sears. I know I hadn't mentioned the truck very much. I talked about the wagons, but his last truck was a 1923 T-model Ford. You sat on top of the gas tank. There were no sides on the cab. I think there had been canvas curtains at one time, but they had long disappeared. It was roofed over, and it had two-part windshield openable in front. And as I say, you sat on the gas tank. Model Ts were a 3-pedal device with a brake pedal, forward clutching pedal which fed into a clutch plate, and a reverse clutching pedal which fed to a clutch drum. The truck could travel just about anywhere on the farm. I know there were times when he missed the bridge with one wheel and went through forded the brook on one side and hit the bridge with the other wheels on the other side. The truck did not have electric starting, so it was hand cranked to start. One man could do this kind of thing. It wasn't easy, but you set up the levers on the steering shaft and then cranked it up, and once it caught, you came around quickly and reset the gas and the spark levers, and you were ready to go. For this reason, he didn't shut down the engine when he got down to the markets, kept it running, really, because it was easy that way. And there was one time at the Green when his 5-year-old grandson, Teddy, whom he had left in the cab, got the thing going and went through the window in Johnson's meat market. Over the years, Mr. Lobdell had many boys and young men from around town work for him and get a few cents income helping him out. Seymour Wells used to, in the earliest days, be one of Lobdell's workers, and he would take the produce all the way up to Derby with horse and wagon. Irv Parrott later on. My brother Lew Knapp was Lobdell's helper for a number of years, and when I was a kid, Steve Moyer, who was in his early teens, was a very good helper for the old man. But he did most of what he did himself, and as I say, in the 70s and 80s, he was still hoisting heavy loads and doing lots of heavy work. It really was the end of an era, but it was a marvelous training job for a young man going out into life, and certainly gave us skills that we could get in no other way.
Side B of this tape gives a more detailed description of things that I do remember. The addenda there cover a series of objects in greater detail. This is side B on a tape describing Lobdell's farm. This side is an addenda to side A and gives additional information on a series of subjects that were discussed on side A. The insides of the barn and the shop. I remember the barn itself as having one large sliding opening on the east side. That's the side toward the driveway and the house. The main part of the barn also had a sliding door on the north side, which was adjacent to the lane or Mount Pleasant Avenue. But in my lifetime, I don't believe that sliding door was ever opened. It may even have been sealed shut. The barn had one window on the east side and two on the south, so that the morning sun did come pouring into that room. In the winter time, there were a series of marvelous smells in the room. It had a bench along the south side, a workbench, and then to the west of that there were a series of barrels that contained food for chickens and horse. The floor of the barn would sometimes be piled up with fertilizer, but in the wintertime it was just as likely to contain burlap bags full of turnips and baskets of apples. The russets, which at that time still grew on some apple trees, were stored there, and although they weren't very nice appearing apples, they were usually rusty and a little bumpy and all that kind of thing. They were the most marvelous smelling apple there was, and by the time February came around, they were absolutely delicious flavors. On the east wall, next to the sliding door, was a drill press, and this drill press was operated by cranking a wheel with one hand, while with the other hand you levered the drill bit down into what it was that you were drilling, and that was mounted on the wall. There were no power tools at all, and there was very little lighting in the barn. There were a few electric lights in the ceiling that you pulled with a cord. The barrels that I was talking about contained supplementary food. There was a barrel of molasses for the horse, and he got that, and he got malt and oats and things like that to supplement his general feed. The horse was also very fond of apples, and would take them from your hand if you held the hand flat. You had to remember to leave the hand flat, because he didn't realize that he could bite your fingers off. The shop itself covered about half the area of the building that we called the shop, the other half being the area where the truck and the wagon were kept. The truck got used for picking up vegetables throughout the farm, and then for taking them to market. The markets originally were quite extensive. Mr. Lobdell drove over to Bridgeport and drove up to Shelton and Derby to sell vegetables. As I mentioned earlier, in the early days, Seymour Wells did some of this for him. As time went on, the distribution of Lobdell's vegetables became more limited. He certainly served the stores in the Stratford Center. Kelman's were customers of his, and before that Johnson's and Newton Reed's. At the Green, his customers included Carl Helbig's stores, and of course that of Vic. Vic's was just about purely a vegetable market. As the 1923 truck aged, he did have more and more difficulties with it. The Model T was a very simple machine, but it did have its foibles and its problems. Clutches and bearings and things of that sort often went. I remember in the late 40s, in the late 30s rather, Mr. Lobdell saying, "I'll never do business with Henry Ford again," because he couldn't get some parts from Sears and Roebuck, and he never did. The interior of the shop, I mentioned earlier, also had its bench, and some of the celery cutting in the wintertime used to have been done in there, but he took to doing it outside because it was easier in the later years. Part of that shop room had a chicken wiring across it, and there was a chicken coop inside where I guess laying hens were kept. It was in there that the ladder went through a hole in the floor up to the garret or loft above. In that loft were all sorts of marvelous pieces of equipment, ancient equipment and harness and things of that sort. And there was the sleigh. I remember the first time I found the sleigh, there were chicken eggs in the seat. I don't know how long they'd been there, but you had to be a little careful when you moved around up there for fear that you would be crushing rotten eggs. Corn shocks. I mentioned that the interior of the barn, part of it was reserved for corn stalks for the cattle. What was done when a cornfield was completely picked, the stalks rather were allowed to stand for a while, and then you would come through with corn cutters. These had a kind of curved blade and usually a handmade 2-foot long handle. You grabbed the corn stalk with one hand and whacked away at its base with this sharpened corn cutter, and then took it over to put it on the corn shocks. In the fields, every 60 feet or so, you would take 2 stalks of corn and bind them together to serve as a base, and then upon that you would lay vertical corn stalks. And as you built this thing up, it became the kind of corn shock that you see in the fields and old paintings in Vermont. They might be 3 feet in diameter and stood there until needed. When it was time to take them down to the barn, and this was done usually before the coldest of weather, but when it was time to take them down to the barn, Mr. Lobdell would often come up to our house and get our collie dog, Sport. Our beagles were good rabbiters, but Sport was the best ratter in the world. And of course these shocks in the autumn as the weather got colder were ideal places for rats to live, because there were still ears of corn, dried ears of corn, on some of the stalks, and so the rats had not only their food but their houses available for them. And when you took the shocks apart, they dashed all over the place. Sport would go charging after them, and Mr. Lobdell would get rid of some of his vermin. Organic fertilizer. I mentioned earlier on using fresh horse manure in the hotbeds, but manure was spread all across the fields prior, with the dump cart, prior to planting, prior to plowing, really. The best manure, that with the most nutrient in it, usually was the cow manure. It was about 3 or 4 times as good as the horse manure, but you used what you had and supplemented it with the chemical fertilizer. Chemical fertilizer really was about 4 to 5 times as strong as manure, but the natural fertilizer had lots of elements to allow the soil to build up. They made for good mulch and good loam as time went on. He used not only his own animals' manure, but he did go out and find it in other places. Raymond describes going down to the center to Johnson's store to pick up manure, and Johnson's wouldn't telephone Mr. Lobdell until they had an absolutely huge load, and the load was in the shed behind the store. The store stood on the west side of Stratford Center, about where the turnpike is now. And Ray described going down there and finding that they had filled the shed practically up to the roof. So he was sent up to the top of this pile and had to lie on his side just below the roof and push it down till he got to the point where he could stand. The horse and wagon then brought the manure home to the farm. Ray remembers sometime in the very early 20s going over to the circus grounds on State Street in Bridgeport and bringing home loads of elephant manure. Anywhere you could get this organic fertilizer, you did, and it was useful and saved you from having to buy the commercial fertilizers. Controlling Chubby. I started to mention earlier on that Chubby was a person in his own right, had his own mind about things. He was very obedient to Mr. Lobdell. He took commands very well and sounded like a well-educated horse. As a matter of fact, Mr. Lobdell's commands early when he first got Chubby were yaw for get along or get ap, and whoa for whoa. As time went on, I would hear him saying to the horse to make him move forward, commence. The horse had some contempt for me, and didn't pay very much attention to my commands. Lobdell tried to teach me to control the animal, but I was never very good at it. He would more or less respond when he wanted to. I do remember one time being up in the southwest field, and we had the truck up there, and Mr. Lobdell drove back on the truck, told me to bring the horse and wagon down. We no longer had cows at this time, so the gate between the pasture and the lane was left open. The wagon was already headed toward the barn, and Chubby always did operate a little more rapidly when he was heading toward the barn than when he was heading away from it. So I clicked the reins on his back lightly, and he started. As he went down through the pasture, he gathered speed, and where we were supposed to cross the brook on the bridge, we did that one wheel on the bridge, one wheel through the pool trick, and he himself headed for the gate to the lane, or headed for the opening to the lane. I didn't have to do much more after that. By this time he was trotting at a fair pace and paid no attention to my attempt to get him around the corner into the lane, and I do know that the wheels on the right side went up over the stone wall and over a stump. I thought the whole thing was going to flip over. It came crashing down into the lane, and he galloped down to the barn and stopped at the door. Well, the old man never knew that this had happened. I inspected everything carefully, and by some miracle nothing was broken. But I really never was able to control the horse. In using him for plowing, I would strap the reins were tied together and went around behind you so that you wouldn't lose them completely. But you had to use your hands for several things, and the one hand was kept on each of the two plow handles so as to steer it, and you did have to steer it to some extent to make sure that the straightness of the furrow and the width of the furrow remained proper. You also had to steer the horse using the reins, unless you had somebody else up at his bit steering him along. But if you were by yourself, you had to control the horse and the plow both with your hands at the same time. The other thing to watch out for was, as with the mowing machine, hitting a rock. If you hit a rock with the plow point, the plow tried to turn turtle, and suddenly the handles came straight up, and the cross piece between the two handles of the plow caught you in the gut. So you had to watch out for all of that. Plowing is not as easy as it looks. To show his contempt for me, I'm quite sure that on some days Chubby was deliberately flatulent. Traces of Indians. According to Franz Goldbach, there actually was a little Indian village or settlement on Lobdell's farm where the brook came into the farm, crossed the lane and came into the farm, and where he had built this well that I was telling you about. I don't know how Franz acquired this information, because we never found any traces of Indians at that particular point, and Mr. Lobdell never mentioned them. However, it was a warm, sunny spot with good water supply and things of that sort, and it might very well have been the place where Indians would set up teepees. I do know that after plowing in the springtime, the spring rains would uncover glistening stones that had been turned up by the plow, and when you picked them up you found that they were in fact arrowheads. He had a quart jar down in the barn that was just plumb full of arrowheads that he had picked up over the years
while plowing. The log cabin. As you proceed west from the intersection of Huntington Road and Mount Pleasant Avenue, on your left, on your right, up a small hill is an older house that at this point is kind of packaged in or stuck between a couple of ranch houses. When I was a boy, this was all woods, and from the lane a driveway led between two stone pillars with planting pots on top of them. A driveway led up into the woods and turned to a fairly large building that had been built by an artist lady named Mrs. Hanson in the early 1900s. That place is a log cabin. It's still there. Today it has been covered with materials so that you can no longer see the logs, but it is in fact built of logs, and the logs were exposed when we were a boy, and this is what I referred to as the log cabin. The well at the house. In the corner of the backyard of the house, between the house and the driveway that led into the barnyard, stood the well. This well never did, in my memory, go dry. It was encased with a pair of culvert sections in the upper part, and then below that standard stone lining went down to the base of the well. It was roofed over and had a pulley that at one time had a bucket hanging on each side of it, so that when one bucket was up, the other one was down. One of the buckets had long since rotted out, and one end of the bucket line was tied, and the other bucket usually was kept down in the well, and this way it remained swollen and was able to take water when you drew it up. When you drew it up, there was a 2 or 3 foot trough that you could dump the water into, and then it went to a tub just outside of the well. That tub was kept fairly well filled, because this was a place where the horse was allowed to drink when he was brought back from work in the fields, and it was also a place where the metal milk cans were kept to be picked up by Mr. Wilcoxson or whomever. We, for a period of time, bought milk from Mr. Lobdell. It was less expensive than the delivered milk, although I had to go get it ourselves. And it's about a 10-minute walk from the house down to his farm. We would buy 3 quarts of milk at 8 cents a quart. However, in the summertime, our container, I had to carry these metal containers back up home, but the container, instead of 3 quarts, would often have 6, 7 quarts in it in the summertime. And of course, it was a very rich, heavy, raw milk. It was wonderful stuff. In the wintertime, it was usually down to the minimum, and you'd get your 3 quarts. And I really hated to go down each morning and pick up our milk. I hated to spend the 10 minutes going down in the ice and snow and bringing it back. But as I look back on it, it was pretty darn nutritious and pretty economical in this Depression time. Trees. The farm was pretty open. There weren't many trees. There were some that had been planted. I mentioned the orchard, which stood in the pasture behind the barn. There were a couple of awfully good Baldwin trees at the end of the field that we called the flats, and those trees may still be there. Baldwins last for a good long time, and they had very good apples. Peach trees were planted along the south edge of the flats behind the houses that were later built on Ulrich Road. On the north side of the flats, between it and the pasture, was an ancient cherry tree of a of a type that you don't see anymore. The cherries were not large, but the pits were, but they were absolutely sweet and succulent. With the coming of later cherries like Bing and Oxheart, this kind of cherry tree, I'm sure, has been phased out, but they were absolutely delicious, and it was a huge tree, and never seemed to have any problem with bearing a large crop every year. I remember very close to that cherry tree was a depression in the ground that was about 6 feet square, and that is where one of the previous horses had been buried. That was a grave of one of the plow horses, and the remains of that horse may still be there. Other trees were the nut trees near the hillside field that I mentioned. To the north of that was a nut tree, and that was usually the tree that we cut the branches off to make wooden farm implements. Between that and the southwest field was another nut tree, and along the east stone wall of the southwest field were a series of nut trees, some on Lobdell's side of the stone wall, some on the Strasburger and Mills sides of the stone wall. Between the Monroe Street field and the meadow was a large pepperidge tree. Pepperidge doesn't have much use except for firewood, and even in that case, you really have to cut the tree and split it in the cold of February to get it to split at all, but it does make magnificent firewood. That pepperidge tree was never cut, and again, you can see it forming the rear border of Shepherd Street properties and Mount Pleasant properties. That tree is in place. Another locator tree that I remember was in the pasture on the way up to the meadow stood a single cedar. It was a large cedar. There weren't many cedars on the property. What are the cows trampled them or what? I don't know, but there was this one large cedar whose remains can be seen as a stump alongside the rear porch of the house that it's at the southwest intersection of Shepherd and Lobdell. Where things were, the farm, as I described it much earlier, was a 15-acre farm. If you tried to locate parts of it using present-day features of the land, I might say that the upper part of Shepherd Street, from the intersection of Shepherd and Monroe, around the corner and down the hill to Lobdell Drive, is located in what had been the Pasture and the Monroe Street field. The westernmost end of Ulrich Drive is located in what had been the Pasture. Practically all of the north-south part of Lobdell Drive stood within Lobdell's farm. Its intersection with Mount Pleasant is where the Indian Village may have stood, and where the well was, and where the little bridge that crossed the field was, where Jimmy the Frog lived. Beyond that, as it proceeds south, it passes through what was the hillside field, and then passes through the very middle of what was the southwest field. Lobdell Drive then turns a corner and goes east, but all of that was not on Lobdell's property. That was on property that had been Tom Dew's. The lane that went west from the brook up to Shepherd Street really was along a line which would be today an extension of Monroe Street. In other words, it was somewhat south of where the present Shepherd Street goes east and west. It would be a direct extension of Monroe Street.
The stump that I mentioned earlier would have been north of that lane through the fields. The lane would have been considerably south of that stump. And down on Huntington Road, between Lobdell's house and Breiling's house, were the hotbeds and the celery patch. The celery patch was almost exactly where the synagogue stands today. This, in essence, is the description of a farm, one of the last truck farms in town, in the 1930s and 1940s, as I remember it. Lew Knapp.